The sun was falling in ribbons the color of blood and molasses when Edna May Bennett stood alone at the gate of the house she'd scrubbed spotless every Sunday for 5 years. The wind caught at her apron, tugged her braid loose, and whispered through the dry grass like it had something cruel to say. In the distance, her husband Silas rode away with his back straight and his jaw set, on the same mare Edna's father gave them as a wedding gift. Dust curled behind his boots. Not once did he look back. She held the chipped teacup tighter, fingers raw from scrubbing floors no longer shared. The house behind her still smelled faintly of bread and cedar soap, but it felt hollow. No echo, just absence. Silas hadn't said much. He rarely did. Just a note left on the kitchen table, folded neat and weightless. A man's entitled to a legacy. You understand. No name. No promise. Not even blame. Just the emptiest kind of farewell. Edna didn't cry. Not then. She just stood and watched, long enough for the wind to scatter the chickens and chase the dust into her eyes. Her breath stilled, like something inside had chosen not to move. He was gone by the time the sun slipped behind the cottonwoods. That night, she sat on the front steps with her boots still on, tea gone cold, the air sharp with silence. The cicadas buzzed like sorrow drawn tight. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. She didn't light the lamp. By morning, the town knew. Hollow Creek had a way of speaking without words. It was in the way Mrs. Lang paused when handing over a loaf at the bakery, in the way the general store clerk avoided her eyes when she counted out change. The world kept turning, but Edna was treated like she'd stepped off it. She hadn't borne a child. That was the word not said, but never absent. Not in a town where even weeds bore seed. The doctor had once called it unexplained. A quiet miscarriage early on, then nothing. Edna had buried that grief alone, with the same hands that folded laundry and dusted shelves, waiting for a life that never arrived. Silas had buried his disappointment deeper, with work, with whiskey, with women whose names Edna never asked. He'd waited 5 years before deciding she'd failed. 5 years of quiet suppers, 5 years of watching other women grow round with life and smug with satisfaction. 5 years before he rode out on a red mare, saddle cinched like a final word. Edna didn't return to church that Sunday. The pew felt colder without Silas beside her, not because she missed his warmth, but because the space he left was filled with stares. When the preacher spoke of patience and fruitfulness, she felt a message like a blade. Mrs. Lang coughed loudly during the sermon, eyes flicking over. No one offered her a handshake when it ended. No one said her name. She stopped wearing ribbons in her hair. Instead, she worked. The hens didn't care about her womb. The tomatoes climbed their stakes without judgment. The fence needed mending, and the windows washing, and the roof shingles replaced after the last thunderstorm. She did it all with quiet resolve, sleeves rolled, skin browned by the sun and wind. Once, the wheel of her cart split a spoke while hauling firewood. She knelt down in the dirt, hands smudged, trying to bind it with twine. A shadow fell across her shoulder. "I can fix that," came the voice, low and simple. She looked up into the weathered face of Ezekiel Hart, Zeke to those who spoke to him, which wasn't many. He was the town's wagon maker, a widower with eyes like the inside of a storm cloud. He didn't smile, didn't offer kindness, just solutions. She nodded, and he took the wheel without another word. He returned it the next evening, newly carved, polished, solid. She offered him eggs and thanks. He took only 2. Said nothing. Their silence was companionable. A week later, he brought her a sack of apple seeds, dropped them in her hand, and walked away. She planted them behind the shed. Come spring, they sprouted. Still, the whispers circled like vultures. "That poor thing," they'd say when she passed. Shame about her womb. Can't keep a man with an empty cradle. As if she'd done something terrible by simply not becoming what they expected. She learned to keep her head down, to tuck away the floral dresses, to cut her own hair, to stop hoping. But hope has a way of growing even when no one's watching. One afternoon, she found a baby goat in the brush, no mother, barely breathing, eyes still sealed. Something in her chest twisted as she wrapped it in her shawl and carried it inside. She nursed it on milk warmed by hand, named it Thistle. It bleated like a blessing. Each small act, the sewing of curtains, the planting of beans, the whisper of a lullaby to something not quite human, felt like a vow. I am still here. Spring passed into summer. The land cracked open with heat. The fields rippled gold and brown. One evening, Zeke returned, not with a wheel or seeds, but with a pair of worn leather gloves. For when you're working the fence, he said. His voice sounded like gravel softened by wind. Edna didn't ask why he cared. She just took them, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Later that night, as the air cooled and the whippoorwills sang, she stood by the window and watched the prairie stretch out into the dark. She imagined it might go on forever, endless, wild, and waiting. Silas was gone. Her name dragged through dust and whispers. But the garden grew anyway. The goat nuzzled her palm, and the gloves fit perfectly. There, in the quiet where most folks would have seen failure, Edna felt something else blooming, not loud, not sudden, but steady as the stars above the barn roof. And that was the beginning of everything. The summer came hard and dry, the kind of heat that cracked the earth and stripped the color from everything it touched. Trees that once shaded Hollow Creek now stood brittle and bowed, their leaves like paper that could tear if the wind breathed too rough. But somehow, in the back patch behind Edna May Bennett's house, the garden thrived. Tomatoes ripened like jewels. Peppers curled in green fists. Rows of beans tangled skyward as though chasing something beyond sun. The soil, ignored by most, seemed to bloom for her alone. It was the only place that didn't treat her like she was broken. She didn't ask why the land listened. Maybe it understood. Maybe it, too, had been left behind and made to feel useless. Each morning, Edna tied her hair back and knelt in the dirt, humming to the plants as if they were kin. Thistle, the half-grown goat, followed her like a shadow. The sun cut hard lines across her face and arms, darkening her skin, defining muscles once hidden under modest sleeves. She was not delicate anymore. She was durable. One Saturday morning, as Edna pried a cucumber from the vine, the sound of wagon wheels startled her. She stood slowly, dusting her palms on her skirt. Zeke pulled up in his plain cart, hat low, the rein slack in his hands. He stepped down, boots quiet in the dry grass. In his hand, he held a small burlap sack. "Seed," he said. "For what?" "Whatever you're still willing to grow." She took the sack gently. "You always bring something." His eyes lingered on hers, unreadable. "So do you." She wanted to ask what he meant, but the silence between them didn't mind mystery. Instead, she motioned toward the porch. "Water?" she asked. He nodded. They sat on the steps, sipping from chipped cups. She poured from the pitcher she kept cold by burying it in the earth behind the shed. They drank in companionable quiet, the kind of silence that didn't demand anything. After a time, he stood and tipped his hat. "You ever need lumber, you come by," he said. "I'll pay. Didn't say you wouldn't." She watched him leave, and for the first time in months, she wished someone would stay longer. Later that week, Edna brought eggs to the widow Anders, who'd just buried a cousin in the fever. No words passed between them, but the basket was accepted with a nod. Small kindnesses passed like notes between the lonely, unspoken, yet deeply understood. But the town still murmured. She caught wind of it outside the mercantile, where Tessie Lang stood with her hands folded over a lace parasol and a mouth shaped like a dagger. "She's still young enough to tempt. Don't think she won't," Tessie said to another woman, louder than necessary. "The widow's always the worst kind." Edna's face didn't flinch. She just paid for her salt and soap, and walked out like the words didn't stick to her spine. But that night, she sat with her hands curled into her lap, palms twitching like they missed holding something. The wind had changed. A storm was brewing far off, curling in the mountains. Clouds loomed on the edge of the horizon, and with them came the sense that things were shifting, though not yet ready to break. She felt in her bones. At the fall festival, Edna stood beside her crates of vegetables, arranged neat with pride. Her herbs were tied in fragrant bundles. Her jams glimmered in glass jars. Still, people passed with only sidelong glances. A few nodded. Most did not. The weight of her absence from their pews, their teas, their talk, it hadn't lifted. Time moved, but grudges in Hollow Creek aged like whiskey. A boy, maybe 4 years old, tugged on her skirt as his mother haggled nearby. He looked up at her with solemn eyes, mistaking her for someone else. She bent to his level, her hand steady. "You lost, sugar?" she asked. The boy shook his head. "You smell like green things." She smiled. His mother snatched him back with a scowl, as though he'd touched poison ivy. Edna returned to her table, feeling both seen and scorned. The afternoon wore on. Heat gave way to wind. Storms gathered still, but held their breath. And then, like habit, Zeke appeared. No fanfare, no words, just him, standing across the road, watching her with a softness that made her throat tighten. She lifted her hand. He gave a small nod, then turned to help a vendor lift a barrel into a cart. He didn't speak to her. He didn't need to. That night, she walked home with unsold jars jangling in her basket and an ache behind her ribs. She didn't sleep right. Dreams came, not of Silas, but of the years in between, the empty cradle, the prayers said and forgotten, the quiet grief no one had named. She saw herself barefoot in snow, pregnant with hope, only to wake to the sound of coyotes howling beyond the fence. Morning brought rain. Not a thunderous storm, just a gentle, weeping rain that softened the dirt and cooled the roof. She walked barefoot through the garden, her dress hem damp, the scent of basil and damp earth rich in her nose. Thistle ran through puddles. Edna laughed without meaning to. Something cracked open inside her. She didn't know it yet, but something had begun. Not something loud or sudden. Something like a seed under dark soil, shifting imperceptibly toward light. Days passed. Zeke brought her lumber, didn't ask what she'd build. She took it without asking why he gave. They shared coffee on the porch. Not every day. Just enough. One morning, he came with calloused palms holding 2 saplings, peach trees, young and slender. "I thought the garden could use company," he said. She looked at him then, really looked. Saw the loneliness tucked behind the set of his shoulders. The hunger not for food, but for softness, for place. "I'll dig the holes," she said. They worked side by side, hands muddy, sweat painting their necks. When the trees were in the ground, Zeke stepped back. Rain threatened again, but hadn't yet fallen. "Do you miss her?" Edna asked. He didn't answer right away. "Every day," he said. Then, "But I don't miss being alone more than I need to." She nodded, understanding something she hadn't dared name. That evening, she sat in the doorway, watching the sky bruise purple. Her fingertips brushed the edges of the new gloves he'd left behind last week. The tree stood behind the shed, as if keeping watch. The wind carried laughter from a distant homestead. It didn't sting as much as it used to. Inside, the goat snored softly. The fire snapped, and the tea tasted sweeter than usual, as if it, too, had been waiting for something to begin. The rain held off, but the garden grew anyway. The first sign came quiet. Edna made bent to reach the low tomato vine, and the earth rose up to meet her, sudden and sharp. Her vision swam, and she steadied herself on one knee, the woven basket tipping and spilling red fruit into the dust. A wave of heat swept through her, though the morning was still cool. She sat there for a while, hands braced in the soil, heart thudding a little too hard. It passed, but something stayed behind an echo, a flicker in the blood. She told herself it was the weather, or the long hours mending fence, or maybe the nights she forgot to eat. But that night, she stood at the basin with a cloth in hand, her stomach bare in the lamplight, and watched the rise and fall of her breath. Her body felt like a room someone had entered without knocking. 2 days later, she fainted in the church garden. She hadn't meant to go back, not after the way the stairs clung to her like thorns. But Reverend Dalton had asked if she'd bring herbs for the Sunday soup. She'd obliged out of old habit, or maybe because her heart ached for some small belonging. She woke beneath the wide arms of a cottonwood tree, Tessie Lang hovering above her with a vinegar-soaked cloth, and a look of dread disguised as concern. "Oh, Edna," she murmured, voice laced with drama, "you really ought to be more careful in your condition." Edna blinked. "What condition?" Tessie's brows lifted. "Well, dear, I assumed." She stood then, smoothing her skirts. Perhaps I was mistaken. But the words had already rooted. Edna walked home with her arms wrapped around her midsection, the prairie breeze no longer gentle, but interrogating. By twilight, she saddled her mule and rode to the only soul she could bear to ask. Reverend Dalton opened his door in his nightshirt, eyes soft with sleep and knowing. He didn't question why she was there. He simply let her in and poured her mint tea, then stood by the fire while she sat wordless. "I don't need scripture," she said finally. "You never did," he replied. She laid her hands on her belly, flat as ever. "I need truth." He watched her with the patience of someone who'd buried more children than he baptized. "Then we'll find it," he said. The midwife came the next day, quiet as fog, and left without a word. Only a note folded and tied with twine, pressed into Edna's palm. Her hands trembled as she read it on the porch steps. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Possibly 2 hearts. Possibly 1. Her breath caught on a sob that didn't come. Not grief. Not joy. Something else. Something primal and wordless. The deep ache of waiting too long for a door to open. She didn't tell anyone. Not at first. She worked the garden with cautious hands. When nausea took her in the mornings, she bent over the basin and wept only once. Thistle followed her faithfully, unaware the world had changed. But Hollow Creek was not a town that left mystery alone. Tessie Lang told the butcher's wife, who told the sheriff's cousin, who told half the congregation before the Sunday bell finished ringing. Edna went to town that Monday for sugar and flour and felt every eye on her stomach. Sheriff Otis tipped his hat, though not kindly. "Folks are concerned," he said, voice like old rope. "About what?" "Your welfare. The children." "I only know of one," Edna replied. "That's so." He took a long breath through his nose, then glanced at the storekeeper behind her. "I'd suggest you not cause disruption. Hollow Creek likes its peace." Edna lifted her chin. "Peace isn't always quiet, Sheriff. Sometimes it's just folks afraid to speak." She paid her coin and walked out slow. By the time she reached home, her knees were shaking, but she didn't cry. Instead, she took out the jar of peach preserve Zeke had given her last fall and ate the whole thing with a spoon. When she was done, she wiped her mouth and whispered, "I'm not sorry." Zeke arrived late that afternoon, mud on his boots, a plank of wood slung over one shoulder. "Thought your porch step looked weak," he said. She didn't answer, just stepped aside. He worked in silence as the sun dipped low. When he finished, she brought out 2 mugs of tea. They sat on the new step, shoulder to shoulder, watching the goats chew clover. She spoke first. "I'm with child." He didn't look at her, just nodded. She turned her face toward his. "It's not yours." "I know, but it's not his either." "Not really." Zeke's jaw moved, but he said nothing. "I never stepped out on my vows," she said. "He just never stayed long enough for them to mean anything." Zeke stared at the horizon, where the sky cracked open with lavender and dusk. "He's coming back, isn't he?" "I don't know." He turned to her then, his gaze deep as a canyon. "You scared?" She opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. They sat like that until the moon rose. Weeks passed. Edna's belly grew slowly, but with certainty. She sewed tiny clothes late at night, hands guided more by instinct than skill. Sometimes she'd wake with tears already on her cheeks, dreams full of names and lullabies. She didn't go into town much anymore. The children playing by the well would pause when she passed. Some adults offered thin smiles, as if grief had made her righteous. Others looked away. Still, the Reverend visited once a week, bringing a pie or a hymn or a quiet prayer. And Zeke stayed. Not every day, not every night. But when Edna needed something lifted, built, or simply steadied, he came. Never touched her belly. Never overstepped. Just existed near her like a fence post, holding her world upright. One evening, she found him repairing her barn door. She brought him a bowl of stew and sat beside him. "They're saying it's twins," she said. He blew on his spoon. "Could be. They'll look like me." He nodded. "Lucky them." She laughed softly, the sound strange in her own throat. "Then, I burned the letter I wrote to Silas." He looked at her. I was going to tell him. Thought he deserved to know. But then I thought, maybe this ain't about what men deserve. Zeke smiled, faint and warm. That's the truest thing I've heard all year. Later, she stood at the window, watching him ride off under the stars. Her hands rested over the curve of her belly, a swell of life that pulsed with quiet power. Outside, the wind stirred the wheat. Inside, Edna whispered to the child, perhaps children, growing in secret strength. You are not a shame. You are not a mistake. You are the answer to a question I didn't know I could still ask. And the night, for once, didn't answer with silence. It answered with movement. A flutter beneath her skin, soft, sudden, undeniable. Her body remembered what her heart had long forgotten. How to carry life. How to keep it. How to begin again. The first cry came just after midnight. It split the silence like a crack in glass. High and thin and desperate. Edna lay on the pallet sheet arranged by the hearth, sweat slicking her brow, the fire still glowing low with stubborn embers. In her arms, a boy no bigger than a sack of flour screamed with lungs that had waited too long to be heard. The midwife smiled through exhaustion. That's one, she whispered, voice rough with awe. Edna barely had the strength to nod. The second came 20 minutes later, another boy, furious and pink-faced, born in a rush of blood and trembling prayers. The midwife muttered a hymn and held him up to the light like an offering. Then she laid him gently in Edna's arms beside his brother. She couldn't speak, could only stare, disbelieving. They were here. They were hers. And they were loud. When the midwife left at dawn, her hands aching and her eyes soft, Edna stood on the porch in her nightdress, the twins wrapped in wool blankets, one in each arm. The prairie had never looked so wide. The wind was cold and full of stars still, and she whispered to it, I'm not empty anymore. Word spread fast. By the next week, the whispers that had chased her like shadows turned sharp with judgment, then slower, heavier with confusion. 2 babies. Twins. No husband. Yet Edna walked through town with her back straight. One boy strapped to her chest, the other in a basket by her side. She nodded to the blacksmith, to the seamstress, to the boys selling apples on the corner. She didn't ask for approval. She didn't need it. When the babies cried in public, she didn't flinch. She looked folks in the eye while they looked away. Zeke Hart built 2 cradles by hand and delivered them in the dead of night. He left them on her porch without a word, but Edna knew it was him. She could tell by the carving, simple, careful, sturdy. Like him. She found him 2 days later mending a wheel behind his shop. You could have charged me, she said. He didn't look up. Didn't want to. Well, I could have thanked you. You just did. From then on, Zeke came more often. He never stayed past sundown, never touched the boys without asking. But he held them sometimes, when her arms trembled too much. He brought her oilcloth when it rained, salt when it ran out, and sometimes, when the world seemed gentler, he brought silence and sat in it with her. As months passed, the twins grew. Their laughter filled the house in a way music never could. Edna sang to them when she washed clothes, told them stories as they teethed, woke up with one tucked beneath her ribs, the other with his foot in her throat. Then came the third. She hadn't expected it. A single child, a girl this time, born in the dead of winter while the wind howled and the fire nearly died. By then, Edna didn't question it. She simply wrapped the infant in flannel and whispered, "Welcome, wildflower," before falling asleep with the girl pressed to her chest. The town couldn't ignore her anymore. Not because she asked for their attention, but because her home had become a place of miracles. 3 children, then 5, then 7, and by the end of the 5th year, 10. 10 cries had split her nights. 10 small hands had clutched her shawls. 10 voices called her mama with different inflections, different hungers. And every time, Edna met them with steady hands and eyes that had learned how to weep without bitterness. They weren't all twins. Some were born one by one, quiet and sure, spaced like notes in a lullaby. Others came close together, as if afraid to be alone. She never told anyone how it happened, never explained the impossibility. She had no husband, no answer that fit into polite conversation. When asked, she would smile faintly and say, The Lord gives where he pleases. Reverend Dalton called it a mystery. Tessie Lang called it blasphemy. Sheriff Otis still watched her with suspicion, though his own daughter once came home with a scraped knee and said, "Miss Edna made it better." The town changed around her, slow at first, like snow melting by inches. One child brought her a pie. Another helped plant beans. A woman whose husband drank too hard sent fabric scraps for the girls' dresses. Even Mrs. Lang quieted her tongue when Edna's oldest helped her carry a basket to church. Kindness bloomed not through permission, but through presence. Still, Edna kept her heart guarded. She knew what it was to be abandoned, knew that love, if spoken too loud, could scare off the good in a man like a storm over wheat. So she watched Zeke, measured his silence. He fixed what broke, came when asked, brought nails, sugar, boots, held the children with a gentleness that made her ache. But he never crossed the line she hadn't drawn, and she loved him for it. Loved the way he didn't demand explanation, the way he showed up when her roof sagged, when the youngest ran a fever, when the well went dry and he brought a barrel without being told. One summer night, after the children were asleep and the wind carried a hush across the fields, Edna found him sitting on her porch. He looked out at the horizon. "You're not scared anymore," he said. "No, you should be," he said softly. "You've got too much to lose now." Edna sat beside him. "I lost everything once already," she whispered. "This time, I know what's worth keeping." They didn't speak again, just sat in the dark, listening to the frogs in the creek, to the hum of life within the house. Inside, 10 breaths rose and fell. 10 tiny dreams flickered behind closed lids. Outside, the woman who had been called barren leaned her head on the man who had been called alone. The night wrapped around them like a shawl, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to explain herself to anyone. She had become something more than a scandal. She had become sanctuary. The sun had barely broken when the sound of hooves cracked across Hollow Creek's main road, steady and mean like a memory refusing to stay buried. Edna May heard it before she saw it, heard the cadence, the weight, the way the dust stirred like it remembered who he was. Silas Bennett rode and wearing the same hat he'd worn the day he left, though it drooped now, worn by sweat and regret. His coat was fine but ill-fitted, as though it once belonged to a better man and no longer did. He dismounted outside Edna's home, like someone returning to collect what he believed was still his. 10 children watched him from the garden fence, the older boys squinting with suspicion, the girls quiet as paper. One of the little ones clutched Thistle's faded collar, eyes wide. Edna stepped out onto the porch, her apron dusted in flour, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled high. She didn't flinch, didn't blink. Silas took off his hat, but not out of respect, more like strategy. "Well," he said, "ain't this something?" She looked at him long, and the silence between them stretched taut, older than the oldest child behind her. "What do you want, Silas?" she asked, voice calm, like water in a deep well. He smiled, crooked and hollow. "Word travels. 10 kids, they say. House full of them. I figured," he paused, eyes drifting to the boys. "Figure they must be mine. You couldn't carry back then, and now look at you." Like the whole valley bloomed. A muscle twitched in her jaw. She stepped down the porch stairs slowly, keeping herself between him and the children. "You left, Silas," she said, voice flat. "Took the mare and the last of the grain. Left a note, not a reason. You don't get to come back and count what you think belongs to you." He shrugged. "I was wrong. You proved that, didn't you? Thought maybe we could start again. I got land out in Kansas now. Steady work. I could take the boys. Raise them proper. Give you help." A sound rose behind her, low and growing. One of the girls crying, not from fear but from confusion. The smallest boy clung to her skirt. She didn't raise her voice, just stepped forward until she could see the cracked skin around his eyes. "I didn't prove you wrong," she said. "You were wrong already. I just lived long enough for the truth to outlast your leaving." He stepped closer, something darker in his gaze now. "You don't get to shame me, Edna. Not with some bastard kids and a patched-up farm. I was your husband." "You were a shadow," she said cold, "and shadows leave with the light." Then another sound behind them, boots on wood. Zeke Hart appeared from around the side of the barn, sleeves rolled, hammer in one hand, eyes narrowed. He didn't speak, didn't ask, just stood near Edna like a pillar built to bear wind. Silas turned toward him, grin gone sour. So that's how it is. Edna glanced at Zeke, then back at the man who had once broken her. No, she said. This isn't how it is. This is what survived. Silas sneered. You think this house, these kids, this wagon man, you think any of this makes you whole? Edna stepped closer, her voice suddenly low and sharp as a blade. You didn't leave because I couldn't give you children. You left because you didn't know how to love without owning. The wind caught the edge of her apron. Behind her, the children stayed still, watching like colts too smart to spook. Silas's mouth worked for a reply, but none came. Zeke set the hammer down. Time for you to go, he said, voice quiet but iron-wrapped. Silas stared at him, then at Edna, his expression folding in on itself, pride giving way to something brittle. He spat in the dust, mounted his horse, and without another word, turned back toward the open road. The hooves that had arrived with arrogance now faded into nothing. When the dust settled, Edna knelt beside her youngest and touched her cheek. You're safe, she whispered. You're all safe. Later that week, the town gathered for the opening of the new schoolhouse, a small building built with more sweat than money. Edna's children had helped paint the benches, had carried boards and swept sawdust. The oldest had carved their names into the first desk for Mama. Edna stood in front of the crowd as the ribbon was tied, hands rough and strong, hair graying at the temples, eyes brighter than any girl's. Reverend Dalton spoke of resilience and goodness grown in quiet places. Tessie Lang, humbled by the years, offered cookies from a tin. Sheriff Otis gave a nod no one had ever seen before. Zeke stood at Edna's side, one hand holding the scissors, the other brushing hers. No proposal, no fanfare, just presence earned honest enough. The children laughed in the grass. Music played from a fiddle someone brought, and Edna, watching it all, let her heart rest against something she'd never thought she'd feel again. Peace, not as a gift, but as a right. That night, when the stars scattered wide and wild above the prairie, she sat on the porch with Zeke beside her, her journal open on her lap. The fire was low, the house quiet. She wrote slowly, pausing between thoughts, ink blotted by moonlight. They called me barren. They said I was the empty one. But the garden grew anyway. The house filled. The silence broke. I did not bloom because of him. I bloomed when he left. She closed the book gently, and then she whispered, to no one and everyone, you don't have to be chosen to be worthy. Sometimes, you just have to stay rooted long enough for your own heart to come home. The wind carried it forward, across the fields and into the dark, like a prayer only the land would remember.